The cafe door jingled softly as another patron walked in, bringing with them a gust of cold, damp air from the rainy street outside. I was staring into my coffee, absently tracing patterns on the tabletop with my finger, when I heard a familiar voice. A voice I hadn't heard in years but would recognize anywhere. Liam. I looked up, and there he was. Sam, my ex-roommate, my almost everything. He looked the same and yet entirely different. His dark hair was shorter, neatly trimmed, but his smile, crooked, teasing, and somehow vulnerable, was exactly how I remembered it. My chest tightened, the air between us charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. "Sam," I said, his name feeling foreign and familiar all at once. "Wow, it's been a long time." He slid into the seat across from me without waiting for an invitation, shrugging off his damp jacket and running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. "Too long," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "What are the odds, huh?" I laughed softly, though it came out more like a nervous chuckle. "Yeah, pretty slim, I guess." The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the kind that had been left hanging when we'd parted ways all those years ago. I hadn't seen or heard from him since he moved out of our shared apartment, leaving behind a mix of memories that were equal parts warm and aching. And now, here he was, sitting across from me as if no time had passed. "How've you been?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. His voice was casual, but his eyes told a different story. They searched mine, as if trying to piece together the years we'd spent apart. "Good," I said, though the word felt inadequate. "Busy. Work's been, work." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Same, though I'd trade my job for another night of pizza and bad movies with you any day." The comment caught me off guard, a rush of nostalgia flooding back at the mention of our old routine. Late nights on the couch, the glow of the TV casting shadows on the walls, the sound of his laugh filling the small apartment. It had been simple, easy, until it wasn't. "Yeah," I said softly, my gaze dropping to my coffee. "Those were good times." "They were," he agreed, his voice quieter now. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the silence filled only by the soft hum of the cafe and the patter of rain against the windows. Sam broke the silence first, his tone lighter, but still carrying an edge of something deeper. "So, are you seeing anyone these days?" The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my mug. "No," I admitted, the word feeling heavier than it should have. "You?" He shook his head, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Nope. Guess I'm still holding out for the right person." There was something in the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on mine, that made my stomach flip. I looked away, my heart pounding in my chest, and tried to remind myself that this was Sam, my ex-roommate, my friend, my almost. But the way he was looking at me now didn't feel like friendship. "You want to get out of here?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through my thoughts. I blinked at him, surprised. "What?" "It's loud in here," he said, though the cafe was anything but. "Let's go for a walk or something. Catch up properly." I hesitated, the weight of the past pressing down on me. But then he smiled, that same crooked, disarming smile, and I felt myself nodding before I even realized it. "Yeah," I said. "Okay." The rain had slowed to a light drizzle by the time we stepped outside, the cool air wrapping around us like a damp blanket. The city was quiet, the streets glistening under the glow of streetlights, and the sound of our footsteps echoed softly in the stillness. Sam walked beside me, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, and for a while neither of us said anything. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it was charged, the weight of our shared history hanging between us like a ghost. "So," Sam said finally, his voice breaking through the quiet, "you really haven't changed much, you know that." I glanced at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I mean, you still get that same look when you're lost in thought. Like you're trying to solve the world's biggest mystery. I laughed softly, the sound feeling foreign but welcome. And you still have that same way of making everything sound like a compliment. Who says it's not? He shot back, his grin widening. We walked in companionable silence for a while longer, the rhythm of our steps sinking as if we'd never been apart. The rain had washed the city clean, and the air smelled fresh, tinged with the faint scent of asphalt and wet leaves. I couldn't help but steal glances at him out of the corner of my eye, taking in the way his hair curled slightly at the edges from the rain, the way his shoulders seemed broader than I remembered. "So, what's the real reason you're not seeing anyone?" Sam asked suddenly, his tone light but probing. The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, my gaze fixed on the ground in front of me. "I don't know," I said finally. "Just hasn't felt right, I guess." Sam hummed softly, as if considering my answer. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about the past lately. About us." I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat at his words. "What about us?" He turned to face me, his expression unreadable but his eyes intense. "About how we left things. About what we didn't say." My chest tightened and I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. "Sam, that was a long time ago. Does that mean it doesn't matter anymore?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Because it still matters to me." I didn't know what to say. The truth was, it had always mattered to me too, but I'd spent so long trying to bury those feelings, to convince myself that they didn't mean anything. And yet, standing here with him now, I couldn't deny the pull I still felt, the way his presence seemed to light up something inside me I thought I'd long since extinguished. "Why are you bringing this up now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "I don't want to make the same mistake twice." The vulnerability in his words took my breath away, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I could feel my pulse racing, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and longing. I wanted to push him away, to tell him that we couldn't go back, but the look in his eyes stopped me. "I thought you didn't feel the same," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Back then. I thought it was just me." "It was never just you," he said, taking a step closer. "I was scared, Liam. Scared of what it meant, of what it would change. But I'm not scared anymore." The air between us was electric, every breath, every movement charged with unspoken emotion. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the rain, and it was intoxicating. My mind screamed at me to step back to put distance between us, but my body refused to move. "Sam," I started, but the words caught in my throat as he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back years of longing and unspoken desire. His fingers lingered, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let my hand shift, my fingers curling around his. The world seemed to fall away, the noise of the city fading into the background as I looked up at him. His eyes were searching mine, his expression a mix of hope and fear, and I felt my chest tighten at the vulnerability I saw there. It was raw, unguarded, and it made my own walls start to crumble. "I don't want to mess this up," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "But I need to know if there's still something here, if I'm not just imagining it." There was no point in denying it anymore. The connection between us was undeniable, a thread that had never truly broken, no matter how much time had passed. I could feel it in the way his hand fit perfectly in mine, in the way his gaze seemed to draw me in the way my heart raced every time he looked at me. "There is," I admitted, my voice trembling but steady. "There always was." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then Sam took another step closer, closing the distance between us. His free hand came up to cup my jaw, his touch warm and steady, and I felt my breath hitch at the intimacy of it. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, as he leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice low and full of emotion. "If you don't want this, tell me now." But I didn't want him to stop. I couldn't. So instead of answering, I closed the remaining space between us, my lips meeting his in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative and full of unspoken promises. But it didn't stay that way. The years of longing, the weight of everything we'd left unsaid, came rushing to the surface, and the kiss deepened, becoming something raw and consuming. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, the world around us fading into nothing. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just him, just us, and the overwhelming realization that this moment had been inevitable from the start. When we finally pulled back, our foreheads still touching, I could feel his breath against my lips, his hands still holding me as if he was afraid to let go. My chest was tight, my heart pounding in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "This changes everything," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's about time," he replied, a small breathless laugh escaping his lips. "I've waited long enough." Sam's laugh was quiet but full of something I hadn't heard from him in years. Relief. It softened the tension between us, though it did nothing to calm the racing of my heart. We stood there in the rain-soaked street, his hand still firm on my waist, and I wondered if he could feel how unsteady I was, how every part of me seemed to be trembling with the weight of this moment. I didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate, too clumsy to capture the tangle of emotions coursing through me. Relief, fear, longing, all of it swirled together, leaving me breathless. Sam's gaze searched mine, his expression softer now, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us. "I don't want this to be a mistake," I said finally, my voice barely audible over the soft patter of rain. "It's not," he replied without hesitation, his grip on me tightening slightly. "It never was. We just got in our own way." I looked away, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "I don't know how to do this, Sam. I don't even know where to start." "Then don't," he said gently, his fingers brushing against my jaw, turning my face back toward him. "We don't have to figure it all out right now. Just be here with me. That's enough." There was something in the way he said it, the quiet conviction in his voice that made my chest ache. I wanted to believe him, to let myself fall into the comfort of his words, but years of doubt and self-preservation held me back. Still, when he leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was softer, slower this time, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. It felt different now, not rushed or desperate, but intentional, deliberate. His hands moved to cup my face, his thumbs grazing my cheekbones, and I felt myself relax under his touch. The rain continued to fall around us, the cool droplets mixing with the warmth of his skin, and for a moment it was easy to forget everything else. The world outside didn't matter, only this did. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Come back with me," he said softly, his voice laced with hesitation. "We don't have to do anything, just talk. I want to talk to you." I hesitated, the practical part of me screaming that this was a bad idea, that it was too soon, too much. But the part of me that had missed him, that had spent years wondering what might have been, couldn't say no. I nodded, the motion small but enough to make his expression shift into something almost hopeful. "Okay," I said quietly. "Let's talk." The walk to his apartment was quiet, the tension between us palpable but not uncomfortable. He lived only a few blocks away, in a small but charming building with ivy creeping up the brick facade. As we climbed the stairs to his second-floor unit, I felt my nerves start to creep back in, the reality of the situation settling over me. But when he opened the door and gestured for me to step inside, His smile disarmed me, and I found myself following him without hesitation. The apartment was exactly what I would have expected: warm, inviting, and undeniably Sam. The walls were lined with bookshelves overflowing with novels and knickknacks, and the living room was dominated by a well-worn couch and a coffee table covered in half-finished sketches. It smelled faintly of coffee and cedar, a combination that instantly made me feel at home. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, shrugging off his jacket and tossing it onto a nearby chair. "Want something to drink? Coffee? Tea?" "Coffee's good," I replied, sinking onto the couch and trying not to let my nerves show. He disappeared into the kitchen, and I took the opportunity to look around, my gaze lingering on the details that felt so uniquely him. The mismatched throw pillows, the stack of vinyl records leaning against the wall, the photo of us from years ago sitting on the bookshelf. I hadn't seen that picture in years, and the sight of it made my chest tighten. "Still can't believe you let me drag you to that concert," Sam said, reappearing with 2 mugs of coffee and catching me staring at the photo. "You hated that band." "I didn't hate them," I said, taking the mug he offered and cradling it in my hands. "I just didn't love them as much as you did." He smirked, settling onto the couch beside me, close enough that our knees brushed. "You were a good sport about it. Even bought a t-shirt." I laughed softly, the memory pulling a genuine smile from me. "Yeah, and you teased me about it for weeks." "Because it was adorable," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "You trying to act all tough while wearing a band tee 2 sizes too big." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help the smile that lingered on my face. It was easy, falling back into this rhythm with him, the way it had always been. And yet, there was something different now, something heavier but not unwelcome. It was in the way his gaze lingered a little too long, in the way his hand brushed mine when he reached for his mug, in the way the silence between us felt charged instead of awkward. "Why now?" I asked suddenly, the question spilling out before I could stop it. "Why say all of this now, after all these years?" Sam hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "Because I couldn't keep pretending," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Pretending that I was okay with the way we left things. Pretending that I didn't feel what I felt." His words hung in the air, heavy and raw, and I felt my throat tighten. "What did you feel?" He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought he might not answer. But then he set his mug down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he spoke. "I loved you, Liam," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I think I always did, but I didn't know how to say it back then. And when I finally realized what it meant, it was too late." My breath caught, the weight of his confession settling over me like a blanket. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to something so honest, so vulnerable. But as I looked at him, at the way he sat there, exposed and waiting, I realized that I didn't need to say anything. I just needed to feel. I reached out, my hand settling on his, and the gesture was enough to make his gaze snap to mine. "It wasn't too late," I said softly, my voice trembling. "Not for me." The tension between us shattered in an instant, and before I knew it, he was pulling me into him, his arms wrapping around me as if he was afraid I might disappear. I could feel his breath against my neck, his heartbeat pounding against my chest, and it was everything I hadn't known I was missing. When he kissed me again, it was different this time. Slower, deeper, filled with all the things we'd left unsaid. His hands were steady on my waist, grounding me as I melted into him, and I felt my own walls crumble completely. There was no fear, no hesitation, just the overwhelming certainty that this was where I was meant to be. Time seemed to blur as we lost ourselves in each other, the world outside fading into nothingness. Sam's touch was steady and grounding, his hands tracing slow, deliberate paths along my back as if trying to memorize every inch of me. His kiss was softer now, unhurried, but no less intense. It wasn't just passion, It was something deeper, something that felt like it had been waiting to surface for years. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine as we caught our breath. His hands settled on my waist, holding me close as if afraid to let go. "I've imagined this 1,000 times," he admitted, his voice quiet and raw. "But nothing comes close to how it feels right now." His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or something closer to hope. I reached up, my fingers brushing against his jaw, and I saw the way his eyes softened at the touch. "It feels right," I said, the words barely audible, but the way his expression shifted told me he'd heard. We stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's arms, the quiet intimacy of the moment stretching between us. The room was warm and dimly lit, the rain tapping softly against the window, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. All the tension, the what-ifs, the regrets, they didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was him, here, now. Sam's hands moved to cup my face, his thumbs brushing gently against my cheeks. "I don't want this to be just a moment," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I want more than that. I want us." The sincerity in his words made my throat tighten, and I felt the sting of tears I hadn't realized were there. "I do too," I said, my voice breaking. "I've wanted it for so long, but I was too scared to say it." He pulled me into him again, his arms wrapping around me in a way that felt protective and tender all at once. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he murmured against my hair. "Not with me." I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe them. He was right. There was no reason to be afraid anymore, not when we were finally here, finally honest, finally together. The rest of the night passed in a blur of quiet conversation and stolen touches, the kind of moments that felt ordinary and extraordinary all at once. We talked about everything, about the years we'd spent apart, about the things we'd been too afraid to say back then, about the future we wanted to build together. And as the hours ticked by, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. By the time the rain stopped and the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, we were lying on the couch together, tangled in a way that felt effortless and natural. Sam's arm was draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my shoulder, and I couldn't help but smile at the thought of how far we'd come in just one night. "You're thinking too hard," he teased, his voice low and warm. I looked up at him, my smile widening. "Just happy," I admitted. His expression softened, and he leaned down to press a gentle kiss to my forehead. "Me too," he said, for the first time in a long time. The quiet between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, filled with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. And as I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm of his breathing lull me into sleep, I knew that this was only the beginning. We still had so much to figure out, so much to navigate, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid.